Hello, thanks for watching another episode of Lessons on Galatians. In the first 5 verses of the letter, we saw the structure typical of ancient correspondence. First the author, then the addressees, then the greeting. We also noticed some additional flourishes that set the stage for themes that Paul will develop as the letter unfolds. With verse 6, though, Paul departs from his typical structure. If he were to remain consistent with all of his other writings, he would continue with a note of thanks and praise to God and tell the Galatians about his prayers for them. You can see a few examples here. You can pause if you'd like to read through them all, but a glance should be enough to see the pattern. In Galatians, Paul breaks from his normal structure, and as a way of expressing the urgency of the matter, he dispenses with the niceties and gets straight to the point. This is a sort of literary version of grabbing someone by the shirt and shaking them awake so they realize the gravity of their situation. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Let's go over now to our one-page format of Galatians to look at the whole section. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let him be eternally condemned. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. Am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? Or am I trying to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a servant of Christ. In other Greek literature, the word translated I am astonished is often used by someone who cares enough about a friend to say something about their self-destructive behavior. Sort of like, I can't believe what you're doing. Now, we should remember that the false teachers weren't telling the Galatians that they should turn away from Jesus. They were telling them that they needed to observe Jewish law in addition to having faith in Jesus. Nowadays, you might hear it phrased this way that, well, salvation is only by faith in Jesus, but of course you also have to, and then fill in the blank with whatever. But according to Paul, adding our own works to Christ's work for salvation, that's a wholesale desertion of Christ. Jesus plus the law for salvation isn't the gospel at all. The Galatians were standing at a crossroads. Would they follow the rivals away from Christ, or would they listen to Paul and return to Christ? Everything was at stake here. So quickly probably indicates that Paul is writing this shortly after his return from his first missionary journey. In such a short time since they first believed, the Galatians were already falling away. Notice that he doesn't dignify the rival false teachers with an explicit identification. He just calls them some people. There would be no question about it among the readers who he was referring to. It's worth thinking about how these false teachers would have interacted with the Galatians. So we know they were preaching. They were presenting something that they called the gospel. They were, according to themselves, advocating for Jesus. We have every reason to believe that they were friendly and winsome. I tend to think that they were fully convinced that what they were pushing on the Galatians was gospel truth. But like wolves in sheep's clothing, what they were pushing was a perversion of the gospel of Christ, which was really no gospel at all. That goes to show that just because someone talks about Jesus and is sincere about it, it does not necessarily mean that they are faithfully preaching Jesus. The most dangerous false teaching is often the least obvious false teaching. In the first verse of the letter, Paul introduced himself as an apostle to emphasize that his message wasn't his message, that he was speaking for God. But even if he, as an apostle, or even if an angel who sits before God's throne were to preach a different message that wasn't consistent with the gospel of Christ, let him be handed over to God to be cursed. Let him stand under God's curse. And if that applies to apostles and angels, then how much more to the false teachers in Galatia who were perverting the gospel? Paul really isn't pulling any punches here. He cares too much about the Galatians, and the danger is too great that he should soften his rhetoric. In fact, it was worth repeating. Verse 9 is a recapitulation of verse 8. When he writes, "as we have already said," he probably isn't referring to what he just wrote in the previous verse. This is most likely a warning that he had spoken to them on his first missionary journey. And it was worth repeating because it was a warning that they had obviously failed to heed. In the first question of verse 10, most English translations are similar to the NIV here. Am I now trying to win the approval of men or of God? The basic meaning of the verb, however, is to persuade, and that meaning is much more likely here. And in that case, it reads, am I now trying to persuade men or God? The unspoken answer is yes to both. Think about the previous verses. He's given the Galatians a stern warning about the false teacher's perverted gospel, and he's also invoked God's curse on anyone who would pervert the gospel. He meant what he said, and he said it in order to persuade the Galatians back to the truth and in order to persuade God to carry out the curse if the false teachers didn't relent. Now, with the second question, he clarifies that while he is concerned about persuading people to the true gospel, he's not concerned about pleasing people for his own benefit. A people pleaser wouldn't have warned the Galatians so sternly. Paul was putting their relationship at risk. Paul isn't out to make or to keep friends for himself, but to make and keep disciples for Christ. Pleasing people at the expense of the gospel is a real temptation for Christians. In fact, in chapter 2, we'll learn about a situation where even Barnabas and Peter obfuscated the gospel in an attempt to keep the peace among people. That's it for now. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer. And if you find these lessons helpful, please give them a thumbs up below and share them with your friends, and I'll see you next time.